Okay, I want you to picture something. Inside every single one of your cells, there's this incredible high-tech factory. It's working 24/7, just churning out the energy that powers, well, everything you do. That factory is the mitochondrion, and today we are taking a deep dive into its most important assembly line. It really all boils down to one simple question, doesn't it? How does your body take the food you eat, that lunch you just had, and turn it into the actual energy you need to walk, to think, to even have your heart beat? That's the big puzzle we're going to solve right now. All right, so we're heading deep inside the cellular power plant, right to the main event, the assembly line. This thing is an absolutely incredible piece of biological machinery. It's called the electron transport chain, and this is where the real magic happens. So what is it, really? The electron transport chain, or just ETC for short, is basically a series of protein complexes. Think of them like little workstations all lined up in a row inside the mitochondrion. And their one big job? To take these high-energy electrons that we get from our food and just pass them down the line, one by one, until they're handed off to oxygen. It's a pretty elegant process. First up, this energy-packed molecule called NADH shows up and drops off some electrons at the very beginning of the line. Now, as these electrons get passed from one station to the next, the energy they release is used to pump protons across a membrane. This starts to build up a really powerful gradient, kind of like water building up behind a dam. And then, for the grand finale, this amazing enzyme called ATP synthase opens up a channel, lets all those protons rush back through, and uses that incredible force to crank out tons and tons of ATP, which is the direct energy currency our cells use for everything. Now, this whole system is super efficient, but it's also got a weak spot. It's vulnerable. So, what happens if someone decides to throw a wrench in the works? What if this absolutely essential assembly line gets sabotaged? Well, that's where something called ETC inhibitors come into play. You can think of these molecules as saboteurs. They are designed to target and block a specific workstation on the assembly line. They just jam up the machinery and stop the flow of electrons completely. And you can see here just how specific these inhibitors are. Each one has its own target. Rotenone, which you find in some pesticides, it blocks the very first complex. Another one, entimicin A, goes after complex 3. And then you have the really infamous poisons like cyanide and carbon monoxide. They go for the very last step, complex 4, and they stop electrons from ever reaching oxygen. And the result is, well, it's catastrophic. If the electrons aren't flowing, the proton pumps shut down. That gradient we talked about just vanishes, and ATP production just stops. It grinds to a complete halt. And that is exactly why these things are so deadly. They literally cut the power to our cells at the source. Okay, so we've seen the assembly line, which is amazing, but there's a bit of a logistical issue. The main fuel molecule, NADH, is actually made outside the factory's inner walls, out in the cytoplasm. And the problem is, the inner membrane is really picky. It won't just let NADH in. So how does the factory get its fuel? Well, the cell is clever. It uses two different delivery truck systems, or shuttles, to get the job done. In tissues that need to be super efficient, like your liver and your heart, it uses something called the malate aspartate shuttle. But in tissues that need energy fast, like your muscles and brain, it uses a different one, the glycerol 3-phosphate shuttle. Now, don't get too caught up in all the different chemical names here. The main thing to notice is the difference. On one side, you have the malate aspartate shuttle. See how it's a more complex, roundabout route? That's because it's all about conserving every last bit of energy. On the other side, the glycerol 3-phosphate shuttle is way more direct. It's faster. But there's a catch. Let's just look at the payoff. That high-efficiency malate aspartate shuttle, it makes sure its electrons get dropped off right at the beginning of the assembly line. And for all that trouble, the reward is about 2.5 molecules of ATP. But now look at the speedy glycerol 3-phosphate shuttle. Because it's so fast and direct, it actually drops its electrons off a little further down the line. It skips the first proton pump. And because of that, the yield is lower, only about 1.5 ATP. It's a classic biological trade-off, right? Speed versus efficiency. So you can imagine a factory that just runs at full speed all the time would be incredibly wasteful. So how does the cell act like a good factory manager? How does it perfectly match energy production to what your body actually needs, moment to moment? It turns out the main control knob is actually really simple. It's just the ratio of ATP to its leftover precursor, ADP.
When you've got lots of ATP, it means energy is high and the system hits the brakes. But when you start exercising, you use up that ATP, and the levels of ADP start to rise. And that high ADP is the signal for full speed ahead. This beautiful feedback system is called respiratory control. The cell only makes what it needs.
And the control doesn't even stop there. This whole system is totally interconnected. I mean, look at this map of the citric acid cycle. High levels of ATP don't just slow down the final assembly line. They actually send feedback to the earlier stages of fuel breakdown and tell them to slow down too. It's this perfectly coordinated, self-regulating dance. Okay, so now that we've got the standard model down, we can really start to appreciate some of nature's incredible variations. Let's check out a few special edition factories that have been re-engineered for some very cool and very unique purposes. Now, that might sound like a weird question, right? I mean, why would a power plant not want to make power? But you'll see, sometimes the factory's machinery can be cleverly repurposed for a totally different job that's just as important. A fantastic example of this is in the brown fat of newborn babies. They have this special protein called thermogenin, and what it does is it creates a shortcut. It basically pokes a hole in the membrane, letting all those protons we pumped out rush back in without going through the ATP-making machine. Now, the energy from that proton flow isn't captured as ATP. Instead, it's just released directly as heat. It turns these little factories into tiny personal furnaces that keep the baby warm. How cool is that? And plants have their own clever trick. It's a pathway called the alternative oxidase. You can think of it as an emergency bypass that lets electrons skip the later parts of the normal chain. It's not great at making ATP. It actually only makes about a third of the normal amount. But, and this is the important part, it makes the plant resistant to poisons like cyanide that would totally shut down the main path. It's like having a backup generator that prioritizes survival over peak efficiency. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, from the deadly effects of poisons to the clever ways plants survive to how babies stay warm, you realize the electron transport chain is so much more than just a simple power line. It's a complex, adaptable, and truly masterful piece of engineering at the very heart of life itself. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If this one single pathway can hold so many incredible secrets about life, death, and adaptation, what other amazing secrets are our cellular factories still hiding, just waiting for us to discover?